All right, well, welcome everyone. This is our initial 1619 project from the Pasadena Village, our initial meeting in 2024. It's going to be a big year, and we've got a lot of good things planned. The information about what's coming up is available on our blog post on our website under the 1619 project. Today we have Brian Biery and Jamala Taylor going to talk to us about prison conditions and how that works and operates. And I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. And basically, I'm going to turn it over to Brian and Jamala at this point and let them take off. So, Brian, it's all yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you all for being here today. This is going to be a fascinating discussion with Jamala, and then also one couple of points that I want you to be thinking about as we get started. The first one is what is your personal experience with law enforcement, with the prison system, the judicial system? Have you served on a jury before? Do you know people who have been incarcerated? What sort of experience have you had and your family, and then friends and colleagues? The next one is to think about overall, what is the purpose and function of the justice system overall? Why was it developed? How did it reach the point where we're at today? Some of what Jamala will be describing will illustrate how it's implemented on a variety of levels. And so what I'd like you all to be thinking about is this the most, and this is how it relates to the 1619 project, is this the most equitable way of adjudicating, processing, recognizing transgression? Are there other more effective ways of correcting behavior? And what could be done as a society to prevent future, and it could be termed violations of the law, it could be termed transgressions, it could be making mistakes, it could be youthful exuberance, however you want to define it. How might we create a safer and healthier society based on some of the observations, input, and experience that Jamala has, that'll be framed by the questions that I have for him. The way this will work is we'll have a conversation. I have a variety of questions that relate to our prison system, our justice system, our law enforcement system. And then we would very much like to open it up to questions to all of you. So I would also encourage you to be thinking about, what else do you want to know? What else would help you to determine how we might make adjustments? And again, it's everything from the police officer on the street to the attorney general or the prosecuting attorney, to judges in the courtroom, to prison guards, to prison wardens, and then thinking about parole and probation and how they are determined and then how they are implemented. So obviously that's a huge swath of our society, but they all need to be reviewed and analyzed. And so in order to do that, we need more information. We need a firsthand experience, and we need someone who has also conducted quite a bit of research in this area and then also has lived experience. So I'd like to, I think many of you know who I am, Brian Biery. I'm a resident of Pasadena. I'm a third generation Pasadenan, and I have provided presentations to the 1619 project on a variety of issues, including our history of racism as well as our education system. So I'm a local writer and historian. And I'd like to present Jamala Taylor, who is the Reentry Manager for Insight Garden Program, and we'll talk a bit about what Insight Garden Program is. And then he's also a certified life coach, which if any of you need a little bit of coaching, I'm sure he'd be willing to offer that service to you or to the Pasadena Village. So Jamala, thank you very much for being here today. I thought maybe to start off, could you describe a little bit of what your connection is to Pasadena and your growing up here, your experience here? Maybe tell a story about your life, your early life here in our community.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. My name is Jamala Taylor. I am proud to say that I am born and raised in Pasadena, St. Luke's Hospital, 1971. Spent most well, all of my childhood in the streets of Pasadena. And I absolutely loved it. I still love Pasadena. I have incredible relationships, friendships, family that still reside in the area. Um, Looking back at it, I do notice that there were always two Pasadenas. And later in life, I'll kind of fast forward a little bit. I'm also formerly incarcerated. I was sentenced in 1990 to 99 to life. And I spent 31 years in state prison. And I was sentenced in Pasadena court. So I grew up in one Pasadena that lives in the shade of another. Uh, I love the Rose Bowl. I love going down there. It was a great place to visit, and it was fully representative of the other Pasadena. I lived more in the Northwest side, Summit, Fair Oaks, that area. And back in those days in the 80s, it was very, very, very different. This was during the time of the explosion of crack cocaine and gangs and these type of things. And externally, the perception of Pasadena, it was only the city of roses. That those things kind of missed us, and it didn't touch, Pasadena. But of course, we know differently. Even like inside of county jails and prison systems, when I first went, the perception was that people from Pasadena were all like rich kids. Hey, what are you doing in here? You guys got money. They just didn't understand the realities of it. I came from a family, a single mom. I had a twin sister, and one of the things I always like to say, there's a perception when people kind of take the wrong course in life is that, it was a lack of parenting. My mom like fought tooth and nail to keep me out of the streets and to get me out of the streets when I was there. But, by the time she really kind of understood the depth of what was happening, it was kind of too late. And I was kind of lost to those streets. I didn't understand the systemic influences of this, both like social, legal, judicial. I came to understand those things years and years later while in prison, kind of working my way out. Yeah.
Let's Jamala, let's talk for a minute about how drugs and gangs impacted Pasadena. I think that bucolic image of the Rose Parade, we just had it a few days ago, perpetuates, all of our consciousness, not just people on the outside, but even people here who live here. But they're unaware. So there's a fair, not everyone, but there are some people who are unaware of especially the 80s and the 90s. I was conducting some research a couple years ago, and the Pasadena Police Department has records of gang-related homicides. And they're averaged between 35, 45, I think the highest was like 48 homicides per year that were gang-related in the late 80s and early 90s. And to put that in perspective, when you're talking about 45 a year, that's almost one a week. Just sit with that. What were the conditions? First of all, from your perspective, how did that get started? How obviously these are national issues as well, and then really influenced by Los Angeles. But how did it get started here in Pasadena, and what was the influence of, say, crack cocaine, and then some of the relationships between the gangs that existed at that time?
Well, I think I would go back to the 70s when I was, 8, 9, 10 years old. Gangs were pretty much just guys that hung out on the corner. Gangs didn't really explode. I think you can probably see the correlation between gangs and crack cocaine. I think the two things that grew out of crack cocaine that people really don't talk about is the explosion of street gangs and the militarization of the police force. That's when that started. The batter ram, SWAT teams, and the LAPD was really the leader under Chief Daryl Gates. I'm sure many of us remember that name and the chokehold and all of that thing. But in Pasadena, it was no different. You know, it started the 70s were more about, they would have these specials on TV about angel dust and superhuman strength and that kind of thing in the 70s. And then in the 80s, the crack epidemic took place and it just ravaged not just this community, but every community. And with it came easy money. Gang territory, places to hang out became like economic bases. So you saw an explosion of money. And with that came sophisticated weaponry. Then you saw franchising of gangs. If you go to places like Denver, Colorado, or Louisiana, you'll see right now today, California-based gangs have franchises in all of these places. Even places like New York and Delaware, it literally franchised all over the country, fueled by crack cocaine. And that ushered in what we know today as the war on drugs. And California or Pasadena was not exempt. To me, that fueled the removal of a generation of Black and brown men from the community. When you have communities that lack economic options, when people grow up and the examples they see, you know, on their porch is poverty. The example they see in their refrigerator is a reflection of poverty. They tend to be willing to grasp at other things. And crack was that other thing. It was cheap, it was affordable, it was very, very profitable. And folks who had been impoverished were immediately flush with cash. And folks made those decisions. And law enforcement organized around the understanding that this was like the plague and needed to be stopped. And they created the war on drugs, which was, you know, the equivalent of the war on terror, only turned inward toward inner city communities. And that kind of started with criminalization. I don't know that most people understand this, but in California today, you can commit a crime that carries 5 years and leave court with a 50 or 60-year sentence based solely on what they call enhancements. The biggest enhancement most people understand is the 3 strikes. Your 3rd strike, you could get a life sentence, 40, 50 years. The first people to be convicted under 3 strikes, the 3rd strike was still in video games from Kmart or still in a piece of pizza. I don't think the people who voted for that intended for that to happen, but that is absolutely the way it was applied. And there's a reason behind that. And it's all rooted in economics. At the time that I went to prison, the strongest union in California was the CCPOA, which is the prison guards union. I mean, incredibly powerful. And they were pushing for prison expansion. So why? Like everything else, all of us are motivated by our own interests. Expanding prisons was in the interest of California Prison Guards Association. If you expand prisons, you hire more guards. You expand the power of your union. And they did exactly that. So the thing is, when you do expand prisons, you have to fill them. You can't spend hundreds of $millions of taxpayer money on a prison and then turn around and say, oops, it's only half full. We really didn't need it. You have to fill it. How do you do that? You ensure that people come to prison and stay in prison for much longer periods of time. So that ushered in all of these laws, 10, 20 life, 3 strikes, thousands of different enhancements. And I saw the population inside of prisons go from maybe the average age of 35 to 40 to 20 and 21. So now you have young men coming to prison, 20 to 21, with triple life, double life. And California had a policy, they didn't release lifers at the time. When I was sentenced to life, it was with the understanding that I was never, ever going to get out of prison. And that didn't really change to say 2010 when the laws changed. And the reason those laws change, I know I just want to touch on this last piece before I yield. The reason those laws change is because the original laws getting people into prisons were so effective that it was busting the bank. You can't build your way out of these laws. They couldn't build prisons fast enough. And eventually folks said, we have to do something different. The court stepped in. prisons were like at 120% beyond capacity, even with the excessive prison building. It was just too much. And that's what brought the political parties together to decide to create laws to kind of let folks out. They created the youth offender laws, SB 260 and 261, which stated if you committed a crime before you were 26 years old, you could go to the board of parole hearings and make your case for release.
So,
Go ahead, please.
so Jamala, you covered a lot of territory there. And let's as a group, let's think about process. Dick, would you prefer that we have questions at the end, or do you want to have questions throughout?
Totally up to you, Brian. You and Jamala, you guys, whatever works for you is what counts. So any way you want to do it.
I'm fine.
Okay, so we can take questions during the conversation. So Linda, just let me frame a couple of points that Jamala made, then we'll go to your question. So he talked about a variety of topics. He covered a huge amount of territory. He just gave you a lesson in incarceration in the state of California in about 10 minutes. So what we're going to try to do is break each of those down a little bit more. So he talked a little bit about enhancements. He talked a little bit about solitary confinement. He talked a little bit about some of the legislation that's occurred to try to change things and why that happened. So we'll go into each of those a little bit more detail. Linda, what is your question right now? And maybe it'll help us to focus in on one of these topics.
Thank you. I was looking at some statistics, but my understanding is that part of the incentive for imprisonment now is based on the fact that there's been, as of 2021, there were privatization of prisons. So there are judges, there are prosecutors, there are others who have an incentive to send people to prison. Apparently, Florida has the highest number of prisoners in private prisons. How does California stand with that?
So let me start off with that, and then Jamala, you can fill in what you know. The state of California, fortunately, does not use private prisons on a widespread basis. What the state of California and many other states use private prisons for are generally immigration issues. So it's detention for individuals who are being adjudicated. It's being determined what their status is. Should they be sent back? Should they be allowed to stay? What is their relationship with people here in California? One benefit of which there are many disadvantages, but one benefit of being in California is that the private prison industry is not as widespread here as Texas it is, and then Florida is, as you mentioned, is probably the leading state. So there, just to end that thought, is there is not as much of a profit motive, certainly within the context of the framing of the prison system in California, as there is in other states. There are other profit motives that I want to ask Jamala about in a second that private corporations benefit from, but it's not a it's in the building, but it's not in the management of systems. Is there anything you want to add to that, Jamala?
Yeah, I would want to say that economies are organic and they transform based on conditions. So California is not a leader today in private prisons. A few years ago, they very much were. And one of the biggest drivers of this was a company called Geo. So going back to the transformational part, when those things started to become out of favor and California started to pull its prisoners back, a lot of other states followed suit and started to do the same. So with that, of course, the money leaves. So now where's that money going? So now the money is redirected. So remember those laws I were telling you about that allowed now for a lot of folks in California to start getting out of prisons. So when I first got out of prison, one of the conditions was that I lived in what they call a transitional home for 6 months. So you wouldn't know this, but these are actually for-profit businesses. But when you get out that first 6 months, the state actually pays for it. They actually funds it. So who's the biggest backer of these transitional homes? GEO. So what they've done is transform from prisons to transitional homes. It's just the other side of the coin, but it's all driven by the same thing: money, dollars and cents. In addition, excuse me, go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's a mechanism. It's also driven by investors. So the people behind GEO look at it as a mechanism for profit and also considerable profit. Jamala, what was the experience like, not only in your transitional living, but what are some, are they luxurious? Do they have high levels of case management? Do they have really high quality food? How are they structured for the most part?
You know what? It really varies. I would say that the GEO facility, they have a transitional facility in the Bay Area on Taylor Street in San Francisco, I believe, is very close to jail. I mean, they literally do in jail at 4 o'clock across the United States, people stand up and they're counted by guards. They literally do that. They do searches and all of that kind of thing. And then you have, like, say the place I was, they didn't have a lot of programming and all of that. And really, that's what I needed was space. So they gave me that. As long as I was back at 10 o'clock at night per my parole conditions and, no dirty urinalysis test, that kind of thing. And then you have a situation, say, for women. Women are the most underrepresented and under-resourced demographic in reentry. A lot of times women are sent to reentry homes that are more drug rehabs. And what that means is you get out, you have 6 months of transitional living. In the first 3 months, you're blacked out. You can't see your family, you can't use a phone, you can't do this, you can't do that. And these are typically, or in cases where the women don't have drug histories. It's just a needed bed, because there's not a lot of resources there. So it just really runs the gamut from, decent to terrible. None of them are great. None of the food is great. Most of them are understaffed. A lot of them are privately owned. And anytime I kind of tell my friends that, like, formerly incarcerated folks are the new foster kids. Like in foster kids in the 80s, there was this thing where people would get foster kids because they came with a check, not necessarily because they wanted to care for them. It's the same thing. People getting out of prison come with a check. So sometimes you have that in the system as well.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Linda, for your question, because you've opened up one area that we did want to talk about. And just to sort of move into that territory, and that's the profitization, the profit motive of prisons overall, and how at various levels there are private corporations that are attempting to insert themselves into our prison system, into our law enforcement system, so then they can benefit from it. And one of the specific ways that Jamala talked about is the purchase of weaponry. That's all privately manufactured, and so those companies reap huge profits off of public dollars. So that's one example, but we're going to talk about another example. I just want to frame what Jamala has been talking about. I'd highly recommend all of you to read a book called The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and it's by a fantastic author and lawyer, Michelle Alexander. An example of what she's talking about is that in 1972, which some of us can remember, Jamala was just 1 year old, there were 350,000 people incarcerated in jails and prisons nationally. Now that sounds like a fairly high number, right? 350,000 people. But within 30 years, that number had quadrupled. By 2010, 2011, 2012, there were over 2 million. It's about 2.1, 2.2 million people in jails and prisons around the United States. So what Jamala was talking about as far as the war on drugs, and then the hyper vigilance of law enforcement. Those are contributing factors to that dramatic increase. And so one of the areas that Jamal and I wanted to discuss is what was, from your experience, Jamala, what was the racial makeup of the prisons in which you were incarcerated, and how was the war on drugs implemented from a race perspective?
Well, the makeup of prisons was largely Black and brown, you know, largely fueled by those laws that I feel kind of specifically target Black and brown folks. And I think in terms of, you know, the war on drugs and the racial breakdown, I think it really comes down to the drug itself. If you remember, what predated crack cocaine was powder cocaine. And in that form, it was very, very expensive, but it was also very, very popular, and it was chic, and it was mostly used by wealthy white folks. When they made these laws to criminalize and attach these incredible fines in prison sentence to cocaine, they made the distinction. They didn't do that to powder cocaine. They did it specifically to crack cocaine, which specifically is in its cheapest form and more accessible to folks of color who are already living in poverty in those conditions. So more susceptible to, you know, using and selling and that kind of thing, having access to. So it absolutely affected those communities disproportionately. And I don't think that was an accident. How could you criminalize one to a greater extent than another when they're essentially the same drug?
And let's talk a little bit about also access to defense counsel. Because of the overrepresentation, and Michelle Alexander talks about some neighborhoods where 1 in 3 African-American males will be touched by the prison system in some way, shape, or form. It's just astounding, the numbers, because for similar neighborhoods that are Latin American, it's more like 1 in 5 or 1 in 7. And then for white neighborhoods, it's much, much higher, 1 in 15 or 20. So from your experience, and then talking with some of your colleagues, how easy was it for people of color to access defense attorneys, and then to be able to utilize the defense system in order to either reduce a sentence or to find people who were actually innocent of their crimes? What was your experience with the defense aspect of a criminal prosecution?
The system is set up for people with resources. If you have resources, you have lawyers, you have investigators, you can operate in the arena. If you're poor, you don't have access to any of those things. You have a public defender who probably representing 70 people that look just like you. It just doesn't have the time to do the job. And I think many of them will tell you that. And even if they did have the time to do the job, so what? Where's the investigator? All of the things that the state have that you should have, you won't have. The state has unlimited resources and you have barely any. So you're starting from a negative position to begin with. And then sometimes people who don't come from this reality, you know, it always comes down where he pled guilty to it. Nobody would plead guilty to something that they didn't do, but they come to you with a deal like, and you look at the battlefield and you can't compete. All you have is the truth on your side that you didn't do it, but every other mechanism is against you over time, and you're sitting in jail for a year, 2 years, going through the system. It's easy eventually to be ground down and maybe take a plea of a lesser and find yourself now a convicted felon. And I'm not saying by any degree that everybody in prison is innocent, but I do think everybody deserves a fair trial. And I don't know that the system is set up for that. The system is a form of ranching. The people in the system are looked at a little more than cattle. When you get to prison, you are a commodity. Little more than that. It's about production, what you can do, and how little they have to invest in you doing it. There are prisons, it's a natural state of prisons to have people doing regular full-time manual labor and pay them 15 cents an hour. Where else can you do that? For things that if those people weren't doing those things, maybe making cheers, the prison would then have to buy those things at market rate. Nobody and no institution should benefit off of the misery of other human beings. And that's the system that we have.
Yeah. So since you brought that up, that was going to be one of the other areas that we wanted to discuss today. In the prisons that you were incarcerated, what were some of the jobs that prisoners had to take? And then when you're talking about whether it's manufacturing or it's some sort of a creation of a product, what were some of those jobs? And because I think people would be surprised to know what is actually manufactured in California State Prison. So can you give a few examples?
So in prison movies, it'll be like license plates and, boots and things like that. But, in reality, it's soap, boxers, the uniforms that you wear in prison, they manufacture them on site, those kinds of things. Those are jobs that are outside the perimeter of the prison. Every prison has a walled off portion of it. That's where all the living units and all of that. And then right outside, there's another portion where they have like the industries, and those jobs are considered industries. So within the walled off portion is basically like porters, that's like maintenance where you sweep and mop, or yard crew where you drag a rake across dirt, that kind of thing. And then, clerks and all of that stuff. Those are pretty cushy jobs. But the reality is so backwards. From a mental standpoint, people are conditioned to believe that, these jobs making soap, these are like the prime jobs. These are the jobs that people really want. Although you're back there 8 to 10 hours and you're making 15 cents. These are like really sought after jobs. 15 cents an hour is really a sought after job. And I think when you're in the midst of exploitation, you don't honestly see, the big picture. And I think the system kind of counts on that. You're not looking at the other end of it, what's coming out of it, how they're profiting off of it. But yeah, those are some.
Yeah, and I want to focus in on that. I want to repeat that because that's so astounding. 15 cents per hour. I want everyone to sit with that. How do you think the California State Legislature, or even the prison, I think it's the CDCR, California State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, why would they pay such a low amount? Why wouldn't they value human life or your work at a higher rate?
I mean, I think you just hit it. The culture that's embedded in the system is one that doesn't value the people in the system. I mean, it just doesn't. It doesn't value us. It doesn't see us as citizens. And a good many people are going to be returning to the world. It doesn't have foresight to see that we can make people worse and create conditions where people, go the other direction or a positive direction. It just doesn't care about that. It wants what it wants. And prisons are about, unfortunately, they're about profit and operation, and that's it.
And isn't it true that, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the number is. There's a certain percentage of people in prison who are lifers, right? Can you describe what a lifer is? But I think it's only like a very small percentage are lifers. Won't like 90% of people who are in prison, won't they be released eventually?
So I don't know what the exact percentage is, but yeah, most of my time I was a lifer, which meant I was sentenced to a life sentence. I was on maximum security prisons. Maximum security prisons are dominated by people with life sentence. That's why they're maximum security. So they have other levels, level 1, 2, and to some extent level 3s, where you have people, 5 years, 10 years, people who are going out or will be going back to the streets. Absolutely.
Yeah, even, I mean, again, I think the statistic is around 90%, but even if it's 80 or 75, that's a huge number. If you're talking about, and just in general terms, when Jamala was talking about the peak of California prison system, there were over 125,000. Well, I think it was up to 140,000 in California State Prison. And then in Los Angeles County, another important issue is that the jail system in Los Angeles County is the largest jail system in the country.
Yes.
There are upwards of 20,000 people incarcerated every night in LA County jails, between 15 and 20, depending on their how full they are. But just to give you an idea, that's like almost the size of South Pasadena, or that's like 2 Sierra Madres of people. What are the conditions like for people who are in I wanted to move to one of the other areas, which was solitary confinement. And you were talking about lifers. What are the conditions like for solitary confinement, and what does that, if we're thinking about a lot of people getting out and then potentially being citizens again, or neighbors, community members again, how does the way the prison is operated and managed, and then also how people are treated, how does that affect when you come out, and how you feel about not only yourself but the people around you?
Well, I think it's incredibly impactful, especially around anger and resentment. I don't know that any human being does well being under the thumb of another human being. And that's exactly how the system is set up. So I served 15 years in solitary confinement at Pelican Bay State Prison. So Pelican Bay State Prison was constructed in a way where they said, let's make this as mentally and emotionally difficult as we possibly can. So you're in a cell with no windows, basically. So I wear these glasses because I went many, many years without sunlight. And that was the norm. And there were many hundreds of men back there in the same situation. We went through a process called validation, where CDC determined if you were a part of 4 or 5 specific, what they consider prison gangs, you could be housed back there indefinitely. And that meant the rest of your sentence. And as most of us had life, that meant the rest of your life. So I did 15 years. There were guys back there who had been there for 30 years. And things of that nature. And there's a lot of resentment that comes with that, because you haven't necessarily broken a rule. It's not, you can murder somebody in CDCR and be back there for 5 years and then get back to the general population. So when you're looking at it through that lens, it just felt like persecution. Many other people who were what they call validated as being members or associates of these particular groups were really activists and organizers. Prison lawyers, people who just consistently agitated and they didn't like it, so they found a way. And I'm not saying that's the case in every case, but that was a substantial part of the population back there. And that does create incredible resentment at the system and individuals at a time when we need, and I'm not like on an anti-law enforcement thing, at a time when the community needs to find a bridge between itself and law enforcement. If we're releasing people who've just been under the thumb of other people, and unfairly so in certain situations, it kind of undermines public safety in that way. That's one of the things I noticed in people coming out. A lot of guys haven't had the opportunity to kind of do the work and kind of resolve those anger issues or those biases against parts of the population. And yeah, I think it really is an impactful thing, living up under those conditions for decades at a time. It's one thing for a day or a week, but it does shape the person.
Yeah, there was for quite a while in reentry circles, there was a comment that CDCR actually was just CDC because they forgot what the R was all about. And for everyone, that's California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So the rehabilitation part wasn't implemented. So it was kind of a joke to have it even in the title. Jamala, you and I have talked about a seminal moment, a critical moment when there was a start for a little bit different thinking. There was a hunger strike that you were a part of. Many people who were incarcerated at the time felt these unjust conditions. And so they felt like the only recourse that they had was to go on strike. Can you talk a little bit about, please share with us what the hunger strike was and then what some of the outcomes were, because I think it goes to your point about removing the resentment or diminishing the anger, or actually better preparing people for coming back to the community. So yeah, I think folks would really be interested in knowing what you experienced.
So the hunger strikes originated in Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit, and it had been building for maybe 2 decades of life in Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit. I mean, collectively, we had tried every legal means you could think of. I think the earliest challenge to conditions at Pelican Bay was something called Madrid versus Gomez. And the end result, and everybody was so hopeful because it was so obvious to us, how inhumane and cruel this place was, intentionally so. So the final verdict from the court was that, look, I believe this is potentially harmful, but the prison hasn't been open long enough. So effectively saying, when you guys start going crazy, we'll know the damage will be confirmed, and then we can do something about it. And yeah, that was a tough one to take. And institutionally, we did all the things you needed to do, the institutional remedies, and it just really came to nothing. And finally, we came together and started talking amongst the population itself, the prison population itself. And that in itself is a huge thing. California prison systems are largely broken down around gang and race. And this kind of breakdown has tremendous history, most of it bathed in blood from as far back as the 50s. So there were real hatreds and resentments. Black folks hated the white folks, and the white folks in prison are usually those wearing swastikas, that kind of thing. Southern Hispanics hated Northern Hispanics, and these were deeply rooted hatreds that had gone on for many, many years. So coming to the point to where we could just have a conversation and kind of start healing those wounds. And, we did that in something called a short corridor. When they did create the validation process, they kind of put us all together. So it became like a hole within a hole. And the other side of that was it was more restrictive, but it gave us the ability to kind of talk and resolve some of the longstanding racial, gang, personal, whatever issues that we had. And that facilitated something that I had not seen in the previous 30 years of incarceration. And that's all of us coming together. I literally had never seen that. In prison, when they buy new basketballs, it has to be one for every race. They can't just throw out a basketball like play. It's that divided. It's like the United States in the 30s and the 40s. Literally different parts of the yard or the building you can't go to. Those showers are reserved for this race. There's an unofficial social structure in place. And we kind of overcame that to plan and execute the hunger strike, which at its height was 33,000 people across the state of California. And it literally brought the prison system to its knees. The governor and the director of corrections at the time, would be on TV in the morning saying how effectively we were terrorists and they wouldn't negotiate, and they'd be on a helicopter on their way to Pelican Bay in the afternoon to do exactly that, negotiate. So finally, we actually negotiated the change in the indeterminate policy, and we suspended the hunger strike a month later. This was in July of 2013, and we were actually all processed out of Pelican Bay.
And just to clarify, what were you asking for? What was the group asking for?
Well, the first thing we were asking for, obviously, was to be released. We were asking for the system to change. They had things that they considered due process, but really it was basically a kangaroo court. So we wanted actual due process. We wanted people back there to be treated humanely. We didn't think that cells with no windows and no access to sunlight that were just literally wearing down people's health was legal or humane, and we wanted that to change. But mostly it was in the structure of the system itself. California's gang interdiction policy was standalone. No other state had the system that California had. No other state. So we wanted them to kind of disband the whole, and ultimately that's what they did.
Yeah, and so the hunger strike was extremely effective. after the hunger strike ended, how did the relationships that were formed, how did they continue on? I think it's fascinating that there could be, especially in an atmosphere where you have to buy a separate basketball for each race.
Yes.
If there was some sort of transformative moment like the hunger strike, how did the racial relationships continue after the activism was over?
You know what? I think that's probably the true beauty of it. Something came out of this that I never thought I'd see. An agreement between the incarcerated population to end all hostilities across prison, period. A signed agreement. And to this day is holding. There's been like a few skirmishes here and there, but all across the California prison system, I mean, the level of violence is nothing like it was prior to the end of the hostilities agreement. That's probably, I feel like that's our collective legacy. The people in prison now have a different environment. Prior to me going to solitary in 2000, as you mentioned earlier, there was no CDCR. They didn't even have the R. It was just CDC. They didn't play at rehabilitation. It was about punishment. It was about lockdowns and violence and all of that. And when I came out of solitary in 2015, I think that it was just completely different. You had nonprofits and free people inside prisons. And the reason you were able to do that because it was a more stable environment. You didn't have to worry about people getting stabbed and shot every day. So you could open the doors and allow for what we have now. So I kind of feel like the legacy that we passed down to, some of the younger people who are coming behind us, unfortunately, is they have the ability to access services in prison that we really never had the ability. All those self-help classes and things like that, conditions make that possible, and we change conditions.
Yeah, and so that leads us kind of to the next area, or one of the last areas that we wanted to talk about. If it's true that 80–90% of the people who are incarcerated are going to be leaving, we as a society should take responsibility for how they approach leaving and then leaving prison, and then how they end up being accepted on the outside. Can you describe a little bit the program? You can even start with Inside Garden program, but talk about explain to us the programs that were available to you after the strike, and then how you made how you accessed them, and then how that helped you, because I know you started to think more deeply about education as well. So how are those showing up in prisons today? How are those programs showing up?
Brian, let me just mention, I see that there's some chat activity going on, and I can't follow that because I can't see it. I just want to make sure that you're looking at it to see if people are having questions or anything that they're putting in the chat.
Yeah, Linda, thank you for mentioning that. But Linda says she worked at a physician in a federal prison in Texas. Amazing life experience. I understood that the stated goals are paradoxical to the effects in those incarcerated. They often re-enter with PTSD from confinement. And that's exactly, Linda, what we're talking about right now, is how do we reduce the amount of PTSD so that then when someone is released, which they will be, how do we make sure that they have a better pathway to success once they're back in our communities? So Jamala, if you could talk about the starting point for that, which is inside. And there's everything from the Actors Gang, and there's Street Poets, and there's Center for Counsel, and a wide variety of other organizations. But what are some of the ones you came in contact with, and how did they help you?
So the very first organization I came in contact with was the Inside Garden program. And I was literally like within days of being released from solitary, my social skills had just literally devolved. I mean, I was in my cell with the lights out, just overwhelmed with noise because I hadn't been around noise or light or movement for so long. And that was like a common thing amongst, folks who had been back there for so long. And I saw a sign-up sheet, the Inside Garden program. At this point, I hadn't seen or touched a tree in probably 20 years, or grass or living soil. Prisons don't have these things. They're excellent places to, one, obstruct the view of the gun tower, a tree. Two, soft soil would be somewhere you could hide things, so they don't have them. Everything is metal and concrete. So you can literally go decades without touching a tree or grass, and that's magnified when you're in solitary. So I just saw gardening and I signed up for it, and it was one of the best things I ever did. I think that class was like the first time I was in an environment where that garden kind of became like church. It just became one of those places where, you know, how you walk into a library and you instinctively start to whisper. It was that. It was that profound. And those social restrictions that we have on us on the yard in terms of who can talk to who, what race can eat after what race, those 2 hours every week, that didn't exist. So it kind of opened me up to possibilities. I saw other men who were further in the process being introspective and talking about their thoughts and their feelings and the impact of the garden. And that wasn't how I was raised. We didn't necessarily eat at the same table and talk about our day. So, you know, that's a skill that has to be developed. So it was modeled for me first. And that helped me prepare myself for the other things I needed to deal with, like addiction, AA, NA, my relationship to gangs and violence and the criminal mentality, CGA. But for this gardening class, I don't think I would have been able to deal with those other things. I wouldn't have been able to change my mindset to one of introspection, looking within and finding, you know, the things I needed to work on and the whys of it all, and then addressing it and speaking to groups on that. And yeah, those things are commonplace now, those classes where people have an opportunity to do the work, to confront their demons, to develop coping skills, to get a handle on anger and rage. And I think one of the biggest things those platforms do, I'm talking about the group platform, is it put me and people who didn't look like me in the same circle, hearing their stories. And although they don't look like me, man, your story sure sound like mine. So instead of the things that separated us, I started to see and acknowledge the things that brought us together, that made us all human. So I was able to accept these folks, you know, on a much deeper level. And I think they were able to do the same. And that creates for, man, we just had an earthquake. You felt that? Oh, hopefully it
Oh,
don't.
it's interesting because it must have traveled from you first and then to Daryl and then to me. I just felt it right now here.
Yeah,
So
the
it
cat
traveled
just
all
took off.
across the valley. So the
Well,
origin's probably up near you, Jamala.
yeah,
So
felt pretty strong too.
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, but I think those classes kind of, you know, now I think folks are coming home much more equipped. And then I think in addition to having these organizations inside prisons, they also have external components like my organization, the Inside Garden Program. Again, the first program I signed up for. So I'm now the Reentry Manager. I lead external operations for that same group. Before I got out, I started college classes, junior college classes. Again, that was something else that I found transformative. Getting my GED. I had no idea. I never thought about going to college. When the guy came to my door and told me I passed the GED, I damn near jumped in his arm like infant style. And it was completely spontaneous, but it marked, you know, my march toward you know, getting that degree. I've recently been accepted in the USC Masters of Public Administration program. I start there in the fall. Just finished my bachelor's last week, and those seeds were all planted in prison in that process. And I think that's the difference between today and yesterday.
Yeah,
And
that's what I was gonna
yeah,
notify everyone that you just earned your bachelor's degree, and I want to congratulate you in front of everybody
thank you.
for doing that. It's hard, you know, it's tough for an 18-year-old to go off to college and earn a degree in 4 years, but imagine some of the challenges that you face to be able to overcome them and ultimately be in a place where now you're ready for studying on a master's level. It's very impressive. So let's talk about when people come out, when folks are released, what are the challenges? What are they faced with? What are the impediments, and how are folks treated? Especially when you think about you know, this whole notion of a felony. How does that impede any progress that you might aspire to make?
You know what? I can honestly say that times have dramatically changed in the state of California. especially in like the academic world. I'm closely aligned with my universities, and that's probably the most accepting environment, in society. And it's probably the quickest way for you to change the trajectory of your life is educating yourself. I've found that I don't go like to colleges like, you first start your class and they want an introduction. I stand on the fact that I'm formerly incarcerated. I tell my story. And that was necessary when I first started because I didn't know how to work technology. I really didn't. So my professors needed to know that, it might take me a little longer. I might, need a little help here or there. I had missed the technology age. But, there are, parts of society that are still lagging behind where, having a record or felony conviction is problematic. I would think the biggest problem are just the skills that you lack from doing time. Again, I missed the technology age, so I didn't know how to operate a cell phone. I had never been on the internet. You can't fully reintegrate into society, today's society, without understanding a basic understanding of computers. You just can't. And so I think that's one of the most common barriers. But one of the things I always like to uplift is women in reentry. This is literally the most under-resourced demographic within reentry. So the entire field, we all need more resources and more opportunities, but especially so especially so when we're talking about women, and that starts with housing. Very few housing options, employment. I think gender-specific reentry plans, thing that starts with family reunification. Family reunification would be good for anybody, but especially women coming out of prison with children. I mean, that's just a common sense deal. And these are things we don't do. The state has all of this funding and they're putting it sometimes in the right place, sometimes not. We need to clarify our mission.
Yeah, the psychological and emotional challenge of, let's say you were in, and even maybe not even incarcerated for as long as you were, but even if it's 5 years or a couple of years, and all of a sudden you're released, and then you have to recraft or remake the relationships that you have with your children. That's got to be extraordinarily challenging. So I think what you're referring to is to have some sort of a, whether it's a therapeutic process or a case management process where there's a conversation or there's relationship building between the parent and the children would be really valuable. Do you anticipate, would you see that that might be provided by the state or maybe by a nonprofit or maybe a hybrid of state funding and a nonprofit?
It has to be a hybrid model. I think the state, has the resources, of course, to do that, and the nonprofit sector has the expertise. When I first became the Reentry Manager of IGP, one of the first things I implemented was our virtual arm, where we could do some of those things virtually. But we have a Thursday night healing circle, whereas our participants who have been out all come together to kind of support each other, offer job leads, or just yell, scream, cry, whatever we need to do. It's a great thing to be supported by anybody, but certainly by people who've kind of been where you are, who may be a little further along, in their journey. And that's the exact same model that like the anonymous groups work on. You notice nobody starts at the same time, different levels of experience to the group. So I'm trying to replicate that. But yeah, those systems definitely need to be hybrid. They need to begin on the inside and carry over to the outside, because it becomes a stressor. These are the things that get people to react in those moments that send them back to prison. That build up. There's already a frustration. I think it's part of the human condition to want to be, or have equilibrium, balance, know where you fit, where you stand, not only, in the world, but in your family, in your own skin. You get out after 30 years, you don't know where you stand. Maybe you married. I mean, where do you stand in your house, in relationship to your kids, in your own skin, society? And that's not a good place to be. People need help walking that part of their journey.
Yeah. Yeah, extraordinarily important. And so hopefully through this conversation, people are thinking about legislatively and then also personally how we might support organizations that we're aware of that can accomplish these goals. One of the other stressors that I wanted to ask you about, because the whole idea is to help people to, I think, recraft their lives, to actually be who they were intended to be and not not, for example, judged as a criminal or as a prisoner, as an inmate or someone who's incarcerated, but to be actually who they were before all of the judicial system took over their lives. One sort of limiting factor in the ability to do that is parole or probation. So while we have a few more minutes, it would be interesting to hear how, because my understanding is you're still tied to the state, right? What is the impact of parole on the reentry process or the reintegration process? And then how might it be improved so that so that folks could successfully reintegrate?
I think it needs to be individualized. I don't think everybody, and let's just call it, for lack of a better term, care. I don't think everybody needs the same level of care. I think certain people might be doing things that dictate they have somebody looking over their shoulder, and other people might be doing things that say that maybe they don't need that. And right now, it's just not that. It's a cookie cutter thing, and at some point, it just becomes a barrier to reentry. In terms of employment, in terms of reintegrating yourself to your family, it just literally becomes a barrier. I think for me, it's kind of a barrier. And thankfully, I have, a lot of support even within parole that makes it a little easier than it otherwise would be. I'm able to travel all over the country and speak and present and do things like that, where a lot of folks in my situation just are not. But yeah, it can absolutely become a barrier, and I'd love to see it be tailored to the individual. I'd love to see it based on, they have these like assessments that are static. So the fact that I didn't have a father immediately elevates my points. The fact that I didn't finish high school, man, that was 30 years ago. Why is that affecting how I'm housed or how I'm supervised today? And that's problematic. That kind of stuff, we should have like needs-based assessments. What do people need to be successful? Let's provide that. Let's get away from the cookie cutter approach.
Yeah, and it would seem like what that would take is a greater investment, right, in parole. So on a couple of levels, one is the assessment process would need to be more sophisticated. And then secondly, then the parole officer, the parole agent, there would need to be more of them to be able to provide a more kind of a one-on-one or a more personal approach to a person's need. Would you say that those are accurate assessments?
I would say that right now, law enforcement operates off of risk base. That's assuming you're going to recidivate. Why not assume you're not? And let's try to support that. The fact that you're not going to go back to prison or you're not going to hurt anybody. And right now, we just don't do that. We assume, what are the risks that this dude's going to go back? So they start off feeling like you're a threat.
Yeah, so it's also changing the mindset of, and I think law enforcement to a certain degree is a representation or a manifestation of societal values. So it would be to have broader support in society to say, look, this person has served their time and they've served their responsibility, or they've complied with their responsibility to society. Let's give them a fresh start, and let's help them to be successful by providing them with, whether it's case management or it's systems navigation or whatever support they need. Then law enforcement follows suit because the rest of society is saying that. So it sounds like it's on a couple of levels. What are some of the ways in which you are helping people as they come out? Because I know that's part of your reentry manager for Inside Garden program. What's your day-to-day look like, and what are some of the challenges you face?
Well, when folks come out, we meet them at the gate, pick them up, give them a cell phone, take them to their first, what we call freedom meal, and then transport to, usually it's a transitional home, but maybe it's a family member's home, that kind of thing. And then we continue to walk with them. Most of the people who work under me are formerly incarcerated. So you have people who are familiar, who can operate in what we call the gray areas, the things that you can't write on paper, just the feelings of it all. You know, one of the things that was unique to my situation, somebody who never been incarcerated probably wouldn't be able to connect with, is being released after such a long time. There was this euphoria, there was this happiness, this love, this joy, and my family was happy and joyful, and that's all I could show them. I couldn't show them the fear. I'm going into a world I do not understand. That's completely passed me by. And I didn't even understand it fully myself till I actually got out and started seeing Walmarts and things like that, right? So I couldn't show them the fear, right? But maybe somebody who's been there, who's experienced, I could show them and I could talk to them, right? And
Yeah,
that's, go ahead, please.
oh, the lived experience that you have is irreplaceable.
That's probably the biggest part of it, is the peer mentorship. Like, you know, the other stuff, the phones, all that stuff, that's stuff. If we didn't do the soft stuff, the lived experience, the peer mentorship, we would be little more than Uber, just going to get somebody and taking them from point A to point B. The people stuff are the relationships. Now, the downside of that, this is a high burnout business, because you're carrying somebody else's emotional weight the more you connect with them, you know, as human beings. So I see a lot of times people do burn out from it. That's kind of a common thing, carrying their own weight plus other human beings' weight.
So let's open it up to, I certainly have a million more questions for you, but let's open it up to the group, and let's take a couple from the chat. Then we'll go to Will. Will, if you can hang on just a second. One of the questions was, what are you studying? And what was your degree in at Cal State Fullerton?
My bachelor's is in sociology. You know, I was a lot of times formerly incarcerated folks go right into sociology and then get an MSW, a master's in social work. But I kind of wanted to be different. My aspirations are a little different. I actually want to lead the organization I work for as an executive director. So I went in public administration with an emphasis on nonprofit leadership.
So let's go to Will, then we'll come back to Stephen's question in a second. So Will, what's on your mind?
Sure, I have a couple of things. First of all, when you mentioned the Inside Gardens project, that really resonated with me. My brother has been working with green prisons and other such programs, and his name is Paul Sheldon. Have you come across him and all? Yeah.
I have not.
Okay, because he was a great believer in just the sort of program, and your testimony of how it basically was like church for you is
Yeah.
pretty powerful. The other thing I was related somewhat, when you're talking about lived experience and people who can relate to each other, I've been using the term a culture of connection, because the relationships among people and stuff are so powerful. And this, I said, when I saw this topic for the very first thing of the year, I said, God, that's depressing. But your testimony is incredibly uplifting. The final piece tying this in is the argument against rehabilitation and such things is it's too expensive. You can't do that kind of stuff because it just takes too many people. What is your experience in the ability to redirect funding to things like the programs you're working with, which can be more effective in getting people back into society and reducing crime? Is there some statistical evidence or other that says we don't need to spend the mint to get good results?
Yeah, and Jamala, I want to hear what you have to say. I also have some opinions on this, and I think a couple of other people on the call have some knowledge too. So, Will, that's a fantastic question, because so much of our society is driven by budgets. It's driven by financial decisions, and it's not driven by what's in the best interest of the individual or even the community, but by how much money we have. So Jamala, what do you think? And then I'll maybe add some to your response.
Well, the first thing I'd like to speak to is value. When we use the word value, it always comes down to money, but value is far more broad and impactful than that. How do you value human beings? That's important. What is the dollar to human ratio? What makes it worth it and not? I mean, not just the quality of the person's life you're affecting directly, but if somebody rehabilitates, what about the quality of the people that this person might otherwise harm that aren't being harmed now? Value. So I don't think you can assign a dollar value to that. I think as as opposed to concentrating so much on the back end, we should also be looking at the front end. I'm like what I call a social abolitionist. I don't believe that prisons are just like going to disappear by an act of Congress. I think that if they disappear, it's because we stop as a society creating people who may one day need to be put in prisons, changing conditions, and that's all of our responsibility. So it's never going to come down to money for me. It's just never going to come down. There's no dollar that I would put on my life and how far I've come and how I think and how I feel now, as opposed to how I did 30 years ago when I was harming people and committing crimes. That's invaluable. And it just comes down to value in human beings. Will the state ever get to a point where we value human beings, all human beings?
Yeah, and for the more cynical in the room, the if you do want to just talk about money, there are stats, there's so much research on how prevention and intervention actually end up saving money, and that it's extremely expensive to have a prison industrial complex, to have a law enforcement system that is, and I'll give you an example, and if any of you want this website later on, and I apologize to Daryl in advance, but when we talk about how much it costs, and I'll just give you some straight figures. For a homicide, it's approximately $1 million. That's base price. That's not even, and so if we want to talk about dollars and cents, it's crazy. That's just one homicide. And if we can prevent that homicide from occurring, we've just saved our community $1 million minimum. And then you talk about, it's anywhere from, at a low range, it's 50, 60,000, maybe 70,000 to incarcerate one person for 1 year in California State Prison. Every person we remove from that equation, that's another 60, 70, 80,000 that could be used for after school programs, community services. It could be used for teacher. That would pay for a teacher, a starting teacher in Pasadena Unified School District for a whole year to be able to educate a child, to be able to say, provide them with the hope and the optimism, and then the education that Jamala was saying is oftentimes missing in communities, lower income communities and communities of color. It's easy actually to build a case, a financial case, for everything from, as I mentioned, prevention and intervention, but also for reintegration, reentry, support, rehabilitation within the context of prisons. It is such a better investment. And another couple of stats. Anybody on the call besides Daryl have any idea what we're spending every year on Pasadena Police Department? It actually went up again. It's staggering. Any guesses? It's around, it was last year. I don't even know what it is this year because it went up. It was $92 million for 1 year, for one city of about 150,000 people, $92 million. You cannot tell me that we are safer because of, or that we would not be safer if some of that money were not invested in housing, healthcare, employment, education, transportation, and then also after school development enrichment programs for young people. It's a staggering amount, and it goes up every year. If you want to have fun, go to a website called Transparent California and see what we are paying law enforcement staff members every year. There are at least, and I'm going to lowball this just so that I don't raise your expectations, but there are at least 25 people in the Pasadena Police Department who are making over $200,000 a year. How many people do you know, just average folks, who are making $200,000 a year? So yes, Will, you just opened up a can of, whatever you want to describe it, a mess. That the financial piece is, there is no validation for increasing budgets for prisons, for just the justice system, for the law enforcement, because as Jamala just pointed out, if we value everyone as human beings, there's going to be a precipitous drop in the negative behavior that causes the need for some sort of incarceration or some sort of isolation. So anyway, I'm done with my pontificating. But Stephen had Dick, before we go to you, Stephen had a couple of questions. So let's move to Stephen, then we'll go to Dick.
All right, thank you. And thank you for the invitation, Bill, and giving me the link on this. And Jamala, I'm humbled and what you have to share and stuff. It's so so disheartening in one way, but encouraged because you represent in such an incredible way. I had a couple of questions. One, which was, in your travels, how has the policies for reentry in other states compare in terms of California? And then secondly, what are the differences in gender for men and women that are in reentry process? Thanks.
Great questions. Thank you. The gender question first, the differences are dramatic. And I think obviously we have a system that's deeply rooted in money, a lot of private businesses involved in reentry. So it always comes down to the bottom line. The fact is there are far more men incarcerated than women. So there are far more men being released than women. So say when you talk about housing, what are the companies they're going to do? They're going to go to the demand. Where the greatest demand is where the greatest profit is. So women are getting short stick. They don't have a lot of options. They have options that really aren't appropriate. And, as I spoke to earlier, sometimes people are placed in drug rehabilitation type transitional without drug histories just because it's an open bed. And that immediately becomes a barrier to reentry, those kind of things. And your second question was?
The second question was the differences that you've seen throughout this country, in your travels, or talk to people,
And I'm actually, out and about talking to a lot of people in the nonprofit sector, but also various Department of Corrections across the country. And one of the things I found kind of shocking is you have places like Louisiana that have programs in place that are far more progressive than California. A simple piece. When people get out of prison, they should have basic documents, right? California ID, birth certificate, social security card, just that. That immediately makes you employable. Right now, we might spend a month or two tracking that stuff down, right? So you're in transitional housing where you have 6 months of free living. Now you got 4 months of free living to try to stack money. Because on 6 months in one day, they're going to tell you to leave. Whether you're going to a park bench or a home or whatever is up to you. And you have a lot of states that have programs in place. And California could so easily do that. And I think those programs do exist in California at lower levels. And that's because of the history of California prisons. People in higher levels were generally lifers, and California did not release lifers. So they didn't really need those programs in higher level prisons because you weren't going anywhere. And now that people are going somewhere, the programs haven't been upscaled to higher levels. And it's just like basic common sense type things that we need to be doing first and foremost, that other states are doing.
Thank you for the question, Steve. Dick, you had a question?
Well, yeah, I have to say I'm overwhelmed by this presentation and the amount of information, and it's hugely depressing to hear the story of the situation that we're in, but at the same time, it's incredibly encouraging to see the transformation and the fact that the California law changed and made such a difference and the existence of a place like Insight Garden and the kind of work that you're doing, Jamala, and the transformation. One of the questions, and I have 100 questions, of course. One thing that I keep coming back to is I'm wondering about what in the world were you convicted of and sentenced for, and what does that say about the over sentencing that takes place to have put you into the situation at 19 or 20 years old, whatever you were in 1990, that put you in a situation where this is what your life has been. I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Well, I don't want to go into the specifics of my convictions, but I will say this. One, I wasn't somebody who was wrongfully convicted. Two, I hurt a lot of people. Three, at the time I was convicted, I was somebody who needed to be removed from other people because I was very different and very capable of hurting people. And I did that. And my crimes or my turn in life were largely fueled by my addiction to crack cocaine.
And we talked about, Dick, we talked about the influx of crack cocaine at that moment and
Right,
how
yeah.
it was predatory, in particular in communities of color and then working class or lower income neighborhoods. And so I think there's a direct correlation between the funneling of that drug and then the results of people who ended up using it, and maybe not originally that wasn't their plan. So there are many layers to these issues, including how our government manages drug distribution, and at that time, what it did. So there's some great articles written. There's a San Jose reporter who looked into this issue quite deeply. So, and I can look up the articles later if you want. But at that time, there was a lot of political involvement in this particular issue as well. And so then people's lives were changed dramatically.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot about the issue of crack cocaine versus other forms of cocaine and how discriminating that is, and so I understand a little bit of that background of that topic. But anyway, I won't take up any more time. Go ahead with wherever you're going.
But I do want to add really quickly. I think all of us are a product of our environment, right? Whatever environment we grew up with, it's going to have a tremendous impact on us as individuals, especially when we're in those formative years. Like today, I really, really, really deeply believe in the power of example because I benefited from it. When I first was released from prison, I was fortunate enough to be in the company of formerly incarcerated folks who were in college. So eventually I found my way to college. When I first signed up for those self-help classes inside prison, I benefited from hearing the stories of other men who were willing to share. So I share the power of the narrative and the power of example. I think that's like incumbent upon all of us. I believe wholeheartedly in like accountability and one taking responsibility, not only for itself, but for its community, for the examples we put out there. It's important when we deal with children to provide love, but it's equally as important to provide an example. I think I'm a great example to people who kind of went off, in the wrong direction and trying to bounce back, but being an example to people who haven't made those mistakes, who haven't been ground up in the system. They don't have to be. That's equally important, and that's incumbent upon all of us.
Another area that I would emphasize as well is the power of transformation and the fact that, and Jamala's just explained that at one point in time, his activities were not healthy for him or for people around him. And yet, he's transformed his life, obviously, with those mentors and with those role models and with those examples. But he's transformed his life in a way that is exemplary and also demonstrates that people can change. I think one of the narratives, unfortunately, in our society is that, especially during the 90s and then the war on drugs and then also the enhancements, was that once a gang member, always a gang member. And that's not true. People change all the time, and with the right support system and the right examples or mentors that Jamala mentioned, that people can ultimately recraft their lives and, as I mentioned before, be who they were intended to be. And yes, spirituality, I'm sure, helps. I know a lot of people who have utilized that as a foundation. Steve, you had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask one sort of question because for me, I know this issue of rehabilitation and when it is not triggered, but that definition makes it hard to achieve the way that it's sold, that they sell it as a non-possibility. And I'm wondering about it because I've seen some states aggressively try to say that released or reentry prisoners that come out still have to earn their citizenship in some way, still have to pay off a debt in some way. And the right to vote is not something that, is available to them. And I just wonder about that because that means that you've never paid your debt. You never have the ability to be whole again in terms of a contributing citizen. And I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, it's absolutely true. There's always going to be elements that don't believe that people can change. I mean, and we're effectively asking the system to operate in its own, not in its own interests. People, individual systems operate in their interests. If people stop going to prison, you don't need prison guards. You're asking prisons to close themselves. And, that's for some people, that's not an issue. For other people, it might be an issue. So that's always going to be there. But I think you brought up something really, really important, like the right to vote and those kind of things. So I've voted since I've been out. And that was like, man, I mean, I didn't think it would be that impactful. I just got a summons to be on a juror. And like every time I got it like 2 nights ago, I tell somebody, people like, look, well, this is how you get out of it. I don't want to get out of it. I want to go. I don't think they probably not gonna see me, but just to go and chop it up. And I want to that's like being a citizen, and that's a sign to me, another step that I'm actually a citizen. Now, are there always going to be people that believe that I should be in prison still to this day? Yeah, that's good. And I'm all right with that. I'm not, and I'm happy I'm not. And it's my responsibility to stand before those people and change their minds, not with what I'm saying, but with what I'm doing, how I'm living. And that I think is very, very powerful.
Well,
Let's lift up
yeah.
Linda's question about spirituality.
Okay.
And maybe not, just one last question, Dick, because I know you want to wrap up.
Yeah, we need to wrap, but go ahead.
Linda says, how did spirituality in any way help in the transformation process? And I'm sure not just in your case, but in others, spirituality plays a role.
It absolutely did, but I'm going to use another name, hope. Hope. Such a powerful thing. When I first went to prison, again, people with life sentences did not get released from prison. So at age 18, I knew that one day I was going to die in prison, whether it be violence or old age or on the floor of a cell. This is it. I'm never getting out of here. And I behaved accordingly. I was hopeless. I had nothing to lose. COs, well, man, we'll write you up. And what, give me 90 days on top of the life sentence I already got? Go ahead. Not a problem. I behaved accordingly. When the laws changed, the reality changed, it was the first time I had hope. People ask me, what did I dream about in prison? I didn't dream in prison. I didn't have dreams. I couldn't afford to have dreams. That's more disappointment. You're going to die here. You got to deal with that, right? Now there's a little light at the end of the tunnel. I can see that pot of gold. So there's hope. And that's what fueled me through all of those late nights studying and, facilitating classes and creating curriculums. It was that hope. I wanted to help, but I also wanted to get out. And the hope that I potentially could was kind of fuel for me to change my life. When the process first started, I wasn't trying to change. I didn't see anything wrong with myself. I knew I had to not do this, that, and this to get in trouble, but that's a Band-Aid. I needed to change who I was, how I thought, what I believed. That took so much time and so much hard work. Self-interest don't fuel that. Hope fuels that. And I think that's responsible for the transformation of prison today. It's far less violent now that you have all of these opportunities and these laws have changed and people have hope. So that's my
I think that's a great message to end on. We're facing a year where I think hope and optimism is the kind of message that we need. And I think this is a tremendous example of hope and optimism actually paying off. So I really appreciate your testimony, your presentation, and your contribution to our 1619 discussion.
Could I say something before we go?
Sure,
Sorry,
go ahead.
sorry, I'm gonna be last. So, I came on last. My name is Daryl Qualls, and so I was a police officer in Pasadena for 36 years. What you guys probably don't know is Jamala is my first cousin, and he's a good kid. I remember him from birth. His mother and my mother are sisters, and so he lived with us through his early formative years. I'm a few years older, but when he was going through his addiction and his troubles, I was a police officer in the city in which he was doing the crimes, but I could never equate that was my cousin. That was the person that I knew. And I've all said this, and Brian knows, we've spoken on panels about this. It was the drugs, because that man that is sitting on this screen was a kid that was affected by, as I call it, the devil walking on the streets, which was cocaine. And it changed who he was, and it changed all of us. When he got out, I cried, because police departments have a policy that says you cannot contact anybody who is in prison, on parole or probation, even if they're a family member. So all of those years, I couldn't contact him. I couldn't, because I would have gotten in trouble at the police department, because that's a policy violation. And so when I did make it to the higher ranks, where I really could care less whether they got rid of me or not, I helped with the Pasadena reintegration program, and we started contacting. And I tell you, it changed who I was. And I talk about this because I am so proud of my little cousin, who has done tremendous things now. So I just wanted to share that before you guys got off the call.
Thank
That's
you.
wonderful. Thank you very much, Daryl. And Brian, thank you very much. You got any closing remarks you'd like to make before we wrap?
I just want to thank Jamala deeply for spending this time with us, and for educating us, and for being so honest and forthright and transparent. And I just wish him the best of luck, and will be supportive as he moves through this. What the closing thought I would leave for everyone is to, again, as I mentioned at the outset, contemplate how our systems are structured and how they could be. Jamala provided us with many suggestions for improvements. How might we step up with our city council members, county board of supervisors, state assembly, state senate, and even the federal government on crafting the changes that are needed, so that rehabilitation and transformation can occur, and that people end up having hope, so that they are willing to make these changes and committed to being members of the community, which is what they were before. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for your questions and your participation. And thanks, Dick, for this opportunity to share this topic with everyone.
Well, thanks very much. And we will put this presentation, this is recorded, and we will be putting this up on our YouTube channel. And you'll be able to find that by going to the PasadenaVillage.org website and look up the 1619 project. There'll be a list there, and there'll be a couple of other places on the website where you can get the links to the YouTube channel, or you can go directly to YouTube and look up the Pasadena Village channel on YouTube, and you'll see it there. It'll take us a few days to get it up, just processing time. But by next weekend, it'll certainly be up. And I would invite you to share this presentation with friends and associates who might have an interest in it. They can go watch it and be inspired by it, as I feel inspired by it. So thanks very much, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again. Our next meeting is on the third Friday. We meet at noon on the third Friday, and then we've got some good programs coming up in February and March too, and you can see those. You can see information about those on our blog website. So thanks everyone for coming, and Happy New Year, and good luck to everyone.